You know that moment when your own family looks at you like you've completely lost your mind? When they roll their eyes and exchange those knowing glances that say, "There goes crazy old dad again." Well, 3 months ago, I was standing in the crumbling doorway of what used to be the Grand Whitmore estate, listening to my son-in-law Bradley laugh so hard, he nearly choked on his overpriced coffee. But before we dive into this shocking family drama, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from all over the United States. "Seriously, Jeremiah?" he wheezed, wiping tears from his eyes while gesturing at the mansion that looked like it had been through a war. "You actually think this disaster is worth something? My God, you can literally see through the roof." My daughter Christina stood there, arms crossed, shaking her head in that disappointed way that cut deeper than any insult Bradley could throw. "Dad, be realistic. This place is going to bankrupt you. The property taxes alone will eat up your entire retirement." But here's the thing about being 62 years old and having worked construction for 40 years. You develop an eye for what's hiding beneath the surface. And as I stood there, feeling the weight of their mockery, I had no idea that within these crumbling walls lay a secret worth more than $250 million. A secret that would turn my son-in-law's arrogant laughter into stunned silence, transform my daughter's disappointment into desperate apologies, and change everything I thought I knew about my late uncle's eccentric life. This is the story of how inheriting what everyone called the worst property in Millbrook County became the greatest vindication of my entire life. But before we get to the part where Bradley literally gets on his knees and begs for my forgiveness, and yes, that actually happened, let me take you back to where this whole incredible journey began. It all started with a phone call that came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in September. I was already up, nursing my second cup of black coffee and watching the sunrise through the kitchen window of my modest 2-bedroom house in Cedar Falls. At my age, sleep doesn't come as easily as it used to, especially after 38 years of marriage to my beloved wife Sarah, who'd passed away 18 months earlier. The caller was Harrison Fitzgerald, a lawyer from Millbrook, a town about 2 hours north that I'd only visited twice in my life. His voice had that careful professional tone that lawyers use when they're about to deliver news you weren't expecting. "Mr. Jeremiah Caldwell?" he asked, though he clearly knew who he was calling. "Speaking. Mr. Caldwell, I'm calling regarding the estate of your uncle, Quentin Whitmore. I'm sorry for your loss." I nearly dropped my coffee mug. Uncle Quentin? I hadn't heard from him it had to be 15 years, maybe more. The man was my mother's brother, a reclusive eccentric who'd made it clear decades ago that he wanted nothing to do with what he called the mediocrity of family obligations. Thank you, I managed. "I didn't even know he'd passed." 3 weeks ago, sir. He was very private about his health concerns. According to his will, he's left you the entirety of his estate, which consists primarily of the Whitmore family property on Maple Ridge Road. The Whitmore estate. Even from 2 hours away, I'd heard whispers about that place over the years. Built in 1897 by Quentin's great-grandfather, it had once been the crown jewel of Millbrook County, a sprawling Victorian mansion set on 47 acres of pristine woodland. But that was decades ago, back when the Whitmore family still had money and influence. "Mr. Caldwell? Are you still there?" "Yes, sorry, it's just surprising. Quentin and I weren't exactly close." So I gathered from his notes. He was quite specific that you were the only family member who ever showed him genuine respect, even during your limited interactions. I remembered those interactions vividly. The last time I'd seen Uncle Quentin was at my mother's funeral in 2008. He'd stood apart from everyone else, this tall, gaunt man in an expensive but outdated suit, watching the proceedings with sharp, intelligent eyes. When I'd approached him afterward to shake his hand and thank him for coming, he'd studied me for a long moment before saying, "You're the only one who didn't ask me for money, Jeremiah. I respect that." "The estate comes with some challenges," Mr. Fitzgerald continued carefully. "The property has been essentially abandoned for the past decade. Your uncle became something of a hermit in his final years, and the mansion has fallen into considerable disrepair. However, the land itself is quite valuable, and there are some family heirlooms and personal effects that might be worth something to the right collectors. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the notes I'd scribbled on the back of an envelope. 47 acres, Victorian mansion, family heirlooms. It sounded like something from a movie, not something that could happen to a retired construction foreman from Cedar Falls. That evening, I drove over to my daughter Christina's house in the upscale Brookwood neighborhood. She and Bradley had done well for themselves. He was a commercial real estate developer who never missed an opportunity to remind everyone how successful he was, and she worked as a marketing director for a pharmaceutical company. Their house was one of those modern minimalist affairs with too much glass and not enough character, but it cost more than I'd made in the last 5 years combined. "Dad." Christina hugged me at the door, though I could see the concern in her eyes. She'd been worried about me since Sarah's passing, convinced I was going to fall apart without her mother to keep me organized and motivated. Bradley appeared behind her, already in his expensive pajamas despite it being only 7 p.m. "Jerry, what brings you by? Hope everything's okay." He always called me Jerry, despite the fact that I'd asked him multiple times to use Jeremiah. It was one of those small power plays he enjoyed, reminding me that he was the successful one in the family now, the one who didn't have to show respect to blue-collar workers even if that worker was his father-in-law. "Actually, something pretty interesting happened today," I said, settling into their pristine white couch, while Christina poured me a glass of wine I wouldn't drink. "I inherited some property." Bradley's eyebrows shot up. "Property? From who?" "My Uncle Quentin, up in Millbrook County." "Wait," Christina said, settling beside me. "Uncle Quentin? I thought he hated our family." "Not hated exactly, just kept his distance. Apparently he left me his entire estate." The change in Bradley's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. He leaned forward, his eyes lighting up with that hungry look he got whenever money was involved. "Estate? What kind of estate are we talking about here, Jerry? Commercial? Residential? What's the square footage?" "It's a 47-acre property with a Victorian mansion, built in 1897. "Holy shit," Bradley breathed, then caught himself. "Sorry. But Jerry, do you have any idea what 47 acres in Millbrook County could be worth? That area's been experiencing major development pressure. I've been trying to get my hands on property up there for 2 years. Christina looked between us, confused. "I don't understand. Is this good news or bad news?" "It's incredible news." Bradley was practically bouncing. "Jerry, you could be looking at serious money here, like life-changing money. When can we see it? I want to get my appraiser up there immediately. We could flip this thing and—" "Slow down," I said, holding up a hand. "I haven't even seen the place yet. The lawyer mentioned it's in pretty rough shape." "Rough shape doesn't matter with that kind of acreage," Bradley insisted. "Location, location, location. Even if we have to tear down whatever's there and start fresh, the land value alone could be enormous." That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about Uncle Quentin, wondering what kind of life he'd lived in that big house all by himself. And I kept thinking about Bradley's reaction, the way his eyes had lit up with dollar signs, the way he'd immediately started talking about we and us when it came to my inheritance. 3 days later, I made the drive up to Millbrook County to see the property for myself. Mr. Fitzgerald met me at his office first, a small but well-appointed suite above the town's only pharmacy. "Before we head out to the property," he said, sliding a thick manila folder across his desk, "there are a few things you should know about your uncle's final years." The folder contained photographs of the Whitmore estate, taken from various angles and distances. Even in the faded color prints, it was clear that rough shape had been a generous description. The mansion was a Gothic Victorian masterpiece that had been allowed to crumble into something resembling a haunted house from a horror movie. Quentin became increasingly reclusive after his wife died in 2010. Mr. Fitzgerald explained. He dismissed all the household staff, stopped maintaining the property, and essentially lived like a hermit in just a few rooms of the house. The local kids started calling it the ghost house and daring each other to spend nights on the property. I studied the photographs, seeing past the broken windows and sagging roof to the magnificent architecture underneath. The mansion had originally been built with no expense spared. I could see hand-carved stone details, elaborate gingerbread trim, and what looked like genuine slate roofing that had probably cost a fortune, even in 1897. Any idea why he chose to live like that? I asked. Depression, most likely. After Margaret died, he just gave up on everything. Stopped answering his phone, had groceries delivered to the gate, paid all his bills by mail. The only person who saw him regularly was Dr. Patterson, who made house calls for his medical needs. And he left everything to me. Everything except for a few specific bequests to local charities. The property, the house, all contents, and approximately $47,000 in various bank accounts. Also, he hesitated. There's one other thing. Your uncle left a sealed envelope with instructions that you read it only after visiting the property. He handed me a thick cream envelope with my name written across it in Uncle Quentin's precise handwriting. The wax seal was unbroken. Any idea what's in it? None whatsoever. Quentin was very secretive about his personal affairs. 40 minutes later, we were driving up a winding gravel road that had once been professionally maintained, but was now more potholes than gravel. Ancient oak trees formed a canopy overhead, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the afternoon sun. When we finally emerged into the clearing where the mansion sat, my first reaction was pure shock. The Whitmore estate was magnificent and heartbreaking at the same time. The mansion rose 4 stories into the sky, a Gothic revival masterpiece with elaborate stonework, towering chimneys, and more architectural details than I could count. But time and neglect had transformed it into something from a nightmare. Half the windows were broken or boarded up. The wraparound porch sagged dangerously in several places. Ivy had grown so thick on the eastern wall that it was literally pulling stones loose from the foundation. It's worse than I expected, Mr. Fitzgerald admitted as we climbed out of his car. But I was already seeing past the damage, my construction-trained eye automatically cataloging what could be repaired versus what would need to be replaced entirely. The bones of the structure looked solid. These old houses were built to last centuries if properly maintained. The foundation appeared intact. The roof was a disaster, but the underlying timber frame seemed sound. Actually, I said, running my hand along a section of intricately carved stonework, it's better than I expected. We spent an hour walking around the exterior, with Mr. Fitzgerald pointing out various features and sharing what little he knew about the property's history. The mansion sat in the center of the 47 acres, surrounded by gardens that had long since gone wild but still showed traces of their former grandeur. There were outbuildings scattered around the property, a carriage house, a greenhouse, what looked like servants' quarters. Quentin had offers on the property over the years, Mr. Fitzgerald mentioned as we walked. Several developers approached him, especially in the last decade when Millbrook started growing. He turned them all down flat. What kind of offers? The last one I knew about was 3 years ago. Some company out of Hartford offered him $2.8 million for the whole property. He wouldn't even let them schedule a meeting. $2.8 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. Even accounting for the extensive repairs the mansion would need, that was more money than I could properly comprehend. When we finally went inside, I had to use a flashlight because most of the windows were either boarded up or so dirty they let in almost no light. The interior was like stepping into a time capsule from 1920, if that time capsule had been left in a damp basement for 30 years. The main foyer was dominated by a grand staircase that curved up to a second-floor landing, with hand-carved banisters that had probably taken master craftsmen months to complete. The floors were some kind of exotic hardwood, warped and water-damaged, but still showing glimpses of their original beauty. Every room we entered was filled with furniture covered in dust sheets, like ghosts of a more elegant era. Your uncle lived primarily in the kitchen and one bedroom on the second floor, Mr. Fitzgerald explained. He had a small generator for basic electricity and used a wood-burning stove for heat. It was tragic and romantic at the same time. This brilliant, eccentric man living like a hermit in a palace that was slowly crumbling around him. I found myself wondering what Uncle Quentin had thought about during those long, solitary years. What dreams or regrets had kept him company in these empty rooms? After Mr. Fitzgerald left, I sat alone in what had once been the mansion's library, surrounded by thousands of leather-bound books that were slowly deteriorating in the damp air. I pulled out Uncle Quentin's letter and broke the wax seal. The letter was written in his distinctive handwriting, the letters precise but slightly shaky, evidence of his advancing age. My dear nephew Jeremiah, if you are reading this, then I am dead, and you have seen what 40 years of neglect can do to even the finest things. I suppose you're wondering why a man who barely spoke to you has left you everything he owned. The answer is simple. You are the only person in our family who ever looked at me and saw a human being rather than a bank account. That handshake at your mother's funeral meant more to me than you could possibly know. By now, you've probably been told that developers have made offers on this property. They see 47 acres of prime real estate. Your son-in-law, yes, I know about Bradley's reputation in commercial real estate circles, undoubtedly sees dollar signs and development opportunities. But this house, this land, represents something more precious than money. It represents the dreams and aspirations of 5 generations of Whitmores. My great-grandfather built this mansion as a testament to what was possible in America, that a man could create something beautiful and lasting if he had the vision and determination to see it through. I have spent the last years of my life watching this place decay, unable to bring myself to restore it because doing so felt like admitting that Margaret was truly gone. But you, Jeremiah, have the skills and the character to bring it back to life. There are secrets in this house that I never shared with anyone, not even Margaret. Some of them are valuable in ways that transcend money. Others are simply the accumulated mysteries of a family that lived larger and more dramatically than anyone realized. Do not let Bradley or anyone else convince you to sell this property to developers. It deserves better than that. More importantly, you deserve better than that. If you decide to restore the Whitmore estate, look carefully in the places where a man might hide his most precious treasures. Remember that my great-grandfather was a collector of rare and beautiful things, and he was also quite paranoid about theft and social unrest. The house will tell you its secrets if you listen carefully. With respect and affection, Uncle Quentin. P.S. The local historical society has extensive records about the original construction and the various renovations over the years. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell is the president and knew Margaret well. She can tell you stories about this place that you'll find hard to believe. I read the letter 3 times, each time finding new layers of meaning in his carefully chosen words. Look carefully in the places where a man might hide his most precious treasures. The house will tell you its secrets if you listen carefully. It sounded like the setup for a treasure hunt, which should have seemed ridiculous coming from a practical man who'd spent 40 years in construction. But there was something about the way Uncle Quentin had written those words, something that suggested he wasn't speaking metaphorically. As the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the mansion's broken windows, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to restore the Whitmore estate. The reaction from my family was even worse than I'd expected. I drove straight from Millbrook County to Christina and Bradley's house, arriving just as they were finishing dinner. Their dining room looked like something from an interior design magazine, all clean lines and neutral colors that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Dad," Christina jumped up from the table when she saw me. "How did it go? What's the property like?" Bradley was right behind her, practically vibrating with excitement. "Jerry, talk to me. What are we looking at here? Commercial potential? Residential development? I've been doing research on Millbrook County all day, and the growth projections are incredible." I sat down at their glass dining table and pulled out my phone, showing them some of the pictures I'd taken. The first few were exterior shots that captured the mansion's current state. Broken windows, Sagging porch, ivy-covered walls. Jesus, Bradley breathed, studying the images. It's bigger than I imagined. Look at that architecture. Jerry, this is a developer's dream. We could subdivide this into 20, maybe 25 luxury home lots. With that much acreage and the Victorian mansion as a centerpiece, we could market it as an exclusive historical community. Actually, I said carefully, I'm thinking about restoring it. The silence that followed was deafening. Christina was the first to speak. Restore it? Dad? Be serious. Do you have any idea what that would cost? A lot, I admitted. But I've been in construction for 40 years. I know what I'm looking at. Bradley leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from excitement to concern. Jerry, I appreciate the sentimental attachment, I really do. But we need to be practical here. This is probably the biggest financial opportunity you'll ever have. You could sell this property, invest the money properly, and live comfortably for the rest of your life. Or, I said, I could restore something beautiful and historically significant. With what money? Christina asked, her voice rising slightly. Dad, you're retired. You live on Social Security and the tiny pension from Morrison Construction. Even if the restoration only costs $100,000, which it won't, it'll cost 10 times that. Where would you get the money? Bradley was nodding along with her. She's right, Jerry. Look, I know this seems romantic, but you have to think about the numbers. A full historical restoration on a property that size? You're looking at minimum $2 million, probably closer to $5 million. Maybe $10 million if you really want to do it right. And even if you somehow found the money, Christina continued, what then? You'd have this enormous house that costs a fortune to heat and maintain, on property where the taxes alone would eat up your entire income. I looked at both of them, seeing the genuine concern in Christina's eyes and the calculating expression on Bradley's face. They weren't wrong about the practical challenges, but they were missing something fundamental. Your uncle lived there for decades without proper maintenance, Bradley continued. The structural damage alone could be catastrophic. Foundation issues, electrical systems from the 1940s, plumbing that probably hasn't been updated since Eisenhower was president. Jerry, you could sink every penny you have into this place and still not make it livable. I've been thinking about that, I said, and I think there might be more value in the property than we realize. What kind of value? Bradley's eyes sharpened. I hesitated, thinking about Uncle Quentin's letter and his cryptic references to hidden treasures and family secrets. Just historical value, antiques, family heirlooms, that sort of thing. Dad, Christina said gently, a few old pieces of furniture and some family china aren't going to fund a multi-million-dollar restoration project. Bradley was pulling out his phone. Look, let me make some calls. I know people who specialize in these kinds of properties. We could have a development company out there next week to do a proper assessment. I'm telling you, Jerry, we could be looking at $20 million in development potential, maybe more. 20 million? Christina's eyes went wide. Easy. Millbrook County is exploding right now. Hartford executives are moving up there for the schools and the small-town atmosphere, but they want luxury housing. We could create an exclusive gated community, market it as Whitmore Estates or something like that. Keep some of the Victorian elements as a clubhouse or community center, then build custom homes throughout the property. The way he said "we" was starting to irritate me. Bradley, it's my property. Of course it is. I'm just saying I could handle all the development work. My company specializes in exactly this kind of project. We'd be partners. You provide the land, I provide the expertise and connections. What percentage are we talking about? Christina asked. Bradley shrugged. Standard development partnership is usually 60-40, with the developer taking the larger share because of the expertise and risk involved. But because Jerry's family, I'd be willing to do 50-50. 50-50. So Bradley would take half the profit from my inheritance in exchange for his expertise. I could see the appeal from their perspective. turn a crumbling mansion into $10 million with minimal effort or risk. But something about the whole conversation felt wrong. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'm going to restore the mansion." The argument that followed lasted 2 hours. Christina tried the emotional approach first, talking about how worried she was about my finances and my future. "Dad, you're 62 years old. This is supposed to be your time to relax, to enjoy retirement. Why would you want to take on the biggest, most expensive project of your life?" When that didn't work, Bradley switched to aggressive practicality. He pulled up comparable property sales on his phone, showed me development projections for the area, even called a friend who specialized in historical restorations to get a rough estimate of costs. "Jerry, I just got off the phone with Rick Morrison. He's done restoration work on 3 Victorian mansions in Connecticut. He says you're looking at minimum $4 million for a proper restoration, assuming there are no major structural surprises. And there are always major structural surprises with these old places." $4 million, Dad, Christina repeated. "Where exactly do you think that money's going to come from?" "Maybe I'll take out a loan," I said, though I knew no bank would lend that kind of money to a 62-year-old retiree. "Against what collateral?" "Jerry, be realistic. No bank is going to give you a $4 million loan for a restoration project." "Then maybe I'll find investors." Bradley laughed, but not in a mean way. "Investors? Jerry, investors want to see business plans, profit projections, market analysis. What's your business plan for a restored Victorian mansion in rural Connecticut?" That stumped me. I hadn't thought that far ahead. "Look," Bradley said, his tone becoming more gentle, "I understand the emotional attachment. Really, I do. But sometimes the most respectful thing you can do with a piece of history is to preserve its memory while moving forward practically. We could create a beautiful development that honors the Whitmore legacy while providing you with financial security for the rest of your life." When I finally left their house that night, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Christina hugged me at the door, but I could feel her frustration in the stiffness of her embrace. "Just think about what we said, okay, Dad? Really think about it." Bradley shook my hand with that firm, confident grip he'd perfected. "Jerry, I'm going to have my people do some preliminary research on the property anyway, just to give you solid numbers to work with. No obligation, just information to help you make the best decision." Over the next 2 weeks, Bradley called me every other day with updates on his research. He'd found 3 development companies interested in the property. He'd spoken with the Millbrook County Planning Commission about subdivision possibilities. He'd even had a surveyor friend drive by the property to assess the acreage from the road. "Jerry, I'm telling you, this is bigger than I originally thought. My surveyor thinks there might be water rights included with the property. There's a stream that runs along the eastern border that could be incredibly valuable for a luxury development." Meanwhile, Christina was working on me from a different angle. She started inviting me to dinner twice a week, always steering the conversation toward my future and my finances. She'd researched retirement communities in the area, printed out brochures for active senior living facilities. "Dad, look at this place, Sunset Manor. It's only 20 minutes away, and they have golf, tennis, a community center. You could have a social life again, maybe even meet someone." "I'm not ready for that conversation, Christina." I know. I'm just saying, if you sold the property, you'd have enough money to live anywhere you wanted. You could travel, see the world. Wasn't that something you and Mom always talked about doing?" It was a clever approach, invoking Sarah's memory to support her argument. And there was some truth to it. Sarah and I had talked about traveling after retirement, seeing Europe, maybe taking a cruise. But those dreams had died with her, and the idea of traveling alone held no appeal. What did appeal to me was the thought of bringing something beautiful back to life, of using the skills I'd spent a lifetime developing to restore the Whitmore estate to its former glory. Every night I found myself sketching renovation plans, researching Victorian architectural techniques, imagining what the mansion could look like with proper restoration. But Bradley and Christina's arguments were wearing me down. The financial reality was undeniable. I didn't have the money for a major restoration, and I probably couldn't get it. Maybe they were right. Maybe the practical thing was to sell the property and invest the money sensibly. Then I met Eleanor Hartwell. She called me on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after my first visit to the mansion. Her voice was crisp and cultured, with the kind of New England accent that spoke of old money and older traditions. "Mr. Caldwell? This is Eleanor Hartwell from the Millbrook County Historical Society. I understand you've inherited the Whitmore estate." "Yes, ma'am. I was very fond of your Uncle Quentin and of his wife Margaret before she passed. I was wondering if you might have time to meet for coffee. There are some things about the property that you should know, things that might not be apparent from a casual inspection." We met the next day at a small cafe in downtown Millbrook. Eleanor Hartwell turned out to be an elegant woman in her 70s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She carried herself with the poise of someone who'd been born to money and social position, but had used both responsibly. "Your uncle was a remarkable man," she said over coffee and homemade scones. "Brilliant, eccentric, but remarkable. Did you know he had 3 master's degrees? Art history, architectural preservation, and medieval literature. I had no idea. Most people didn't. Quentin was very private about his accomplishments, but he was probably the most knowledgeable person in New England when it came to Victorian architecture and decorative arts." She pulled out a manila folder filled with old photographs. "These are pictures of the Whitmore estate from various periods. This one is from 1902, just after the original construction was completed." The photograph took my breath away. The mansion in its prime had been absolutely magnificent, a Gothic revival masterpiece that belonged in a fairy tale. Every architectural detail was perfectly maintained, the gardens were formal and elaborate, and the whole property radiated wealth and sophistication. And this one is from 1925, when Quentin's grandparents hosted President Coolidge for a weekend visit. The President of the United States stayed there? Oh yes, the Whitmore family was quite influential in the early 20th century. Quentin's great-grandfather made a fortune in railroad investments, and his grandfather expanded into steel and manufacturing. At their peak, they were one of the wealthiest families in Connecticut. Eleanor showed me more photographs, lavish parties on the mansion's grounds, famous guests, charity events that drew socialites from New York and Boston. The Whitmore estate had been a center of cultural and political activity for decades. "What happened?" I asked. "How did they lose their fortune?" "The usual story, I'm afraid. Bad investments in the 1950s, family disputes, changing times. By the time Quentin inherited the property, most of the liquid wealth was gone. He had enough to live comfortably, but not enough to properly maintain a 47-acre estate. And he never married until later in life?" Eleanor's expression grew sad. "Quentin was a romantic. He spent decades convinced that he would never find a woman who could appreciate both his intellect and his eccentricities. Then he met Margaret when he was 58, and it was like watching a man discover color after a lifetime of seeing only black and white. Uncle Quentin mentioned in a letter that you might have stories about the house that I'd find hard to believe." Eleanor's eyes lit up. "Oh, my dear boy, where do I even begin? The Whitmore family collected secrets the way other people collect stamps. Did you know that during Prohibition, your uncle's grandfather ran one of the most sophisticated smuggling operations in New England? There are tunnels under the mansion that connect to hidden chambers where they stored thousands of bottles of the finest European liqueurs." "Tunnels?" "At least 3 that I know of, possibly more. The family was obsessed with privacy and security. Quentin's great-grandfather was convinced that social unrest might someday threaten wealthy families, so he had various escape routes and hiding places built throughout the property." My pulse was quickening. Uncle Quentin's letter had mentioned hidden treasures and family secrets. "Are these tunnels still intact?" "As far as I know. Quentin took me on a tour of them once, back in the 1990s when Margaret was still alive. Fascinating engineering, really. They were designed by the same architect who built the mansion, and they're constructed as solidly as the house itself." Eleanor pulled out another photograph, this one showing a room I didn't recognize, an elegant study with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and what looked like priceless artwork on the walls. This was Quentin's great-grandfather's private study. The family called it the treasure room because he kept his most valuable collection pieces there. Rare books, original manuscripts, artwork, artifacts from his travels around the world. Is this room still in the mansion? I believe so, though I haven't seen it in years. It's hidden behind a false wall in the library. Quentin showed it to Margaret and me during that same tour. I was starting to feel like Alice falling down the rabbit hole. Mrs. Hartwell, what exactly did the Whitmore family collect? She smiled mysteriously. Everything. Quentin's great-grandfather was what we might now call an obsessive collector. He bought entire estates when wealthy families fell on hard times. Medieval manuscripts, Renaissance paintings, rare gemstones, ancient artifacts. If it was beautiful and historically significant, he wanted to own it. And all of this is still in the mansion? I honestly don't know. After Margaret died and Quentin became so reclusive, he stopped giving tours or talking about the family collections. But I can't imagine he would have sold anything. He was far too sentimental for that. When I left the cafe 2 hours later, my head was spinning with possibilities. Eleanor had given me copies of architectural plans from the original construction, including detailed diagrams of the tunnel system and the hidden chambers. She'd also provided a partial inventory of the family's art and artifact collections, compiled in 1962 for insurance purposes. The list was staggering. Original paintings by relatively unknown, but historically significant artists. Medieval manuscripts that might be worth millions to the right collectors. A collection of rare gemstones that had been assembled over decades of travel and acquisition. But remember, Eleanor had cautioned as we parted ways, this inventory is more than 60 years old. I have no idea what might still be there, what might have been sold or damaged over the years. Don't get your hopes up too high. Don't get my hopes up too high. It was good advice that I completely ignored. That night I spread Eleanor's architectural plans across my kitchen table and studied them like a general planning a military campaign. The mansion was far more complex than I'd realized during my brief visit. In addition to the 4 main floors, there were at least 3 levels of basement and sub-basement chambers. The tunnel system extended throughout the property, connecting the main house to the outbuildings, and even to a hidden exit near the property's eastern border. According to the plans, the treasure room Eleanor had mentioned was accessed through a hidden door in the main library. There were also several smaller concealed chambers scattered throughout the mansion, places where a paranoid millionaire might hide valuables from potential thieves or social unrest. I thought about Uncle Quentin's letter. Look carefully in the places where a man might hide his most precious treasures. He hadn't been speaking metaphorically. He'd been giving me a roadmap to a potential fortune that could make Bradley's development projections look like pocket change. But when I called Christina the next day to share Eleanor's revelations, the reaction was not what I'd expected. "Dad," she said with barely controlled exasperation, "you're talking about fairy tales now. Hidden treasure rooms? Secret tunnels? Do you realize how that sounds?" "I'm talking about documented architectural features and historical records," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. Eleanor showed me the original construction plans. Eleanor Hartwell is 80 years old and probably remembers the mansion from its glory days. That doesn't mean there's still valuable stuff hidden in the walls. When I told Bradley about my conversation with Eleanor, his reaction was even more dismissive. "Jerry, come on. You think if there was really millions of dollars worth of art and antiques in that house, your uncle would have lived like a hermit for the last decade. He would have sold that stuff to maintain the property. Maybe he was too attached to sell it. Or maybe it was sold decades ago, or maybe it never existed in the first place. Look, I've dealt with a lot of old families and old properties. The stories always get bigger and more dramatic with each telling. By the time it gets to the historical society, a modest art collection becomes priceless treasures, and a wine cellar becomes secret tunnels. But I couldn't let it go. That weekend, I drove back to Millbrook County with a proper flashlight, a crowbar, and Eleanor's architectural plans. If there really were hidden chambers in the mansion, I was going to find them. The mansion felt different on my second visit. Less ominous. More like a puzzle waiting to be solved. I started in the library, studying Eleanor's plans by flashlight and trying to match them to the actual room layout. According to the architectural drawings, the hidden entrance to the treasure room should be behind the bookshelf on the eastern wall, approximately 8 feet from the corner. I spent an hour examining every inch of that bookshelf, looking for hidden switches or concealed hinges. Finally, I found it, a leather-bound copy of Ivanhoe that didn't pull out like the other books. Instead, it tilted forward like a lever. When I pressed it, I heard a distinct clicking sound from somewhere inside the wall. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then I noticed that one section of the bookshelf was sitting slightly forward from the rest, as if it had shifted on hidden hinges. I pressed against it, and the entire section swung inward, revealing a narrow doorway behind it. My hands were shaking as I shined my flashlight into the hidden room. The treasure room was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 10 by 12 feet, but every inch of wall space was covered with built-in display cases and storage cabinets, and it wasn't empty. The beam of my flashlight revealed paintings in elaborate gold frames, glass cases filled with what looked like ancient artifacts, shelves lined with leather-bound books that were clearly far older than anything in the main library. There were sculptures, jewelry displays, even what appeared to be medieval weapons mounted on the walls. I spent 3 hours in that room, barely able to process what I was seeing. Some of the items were clearly valuable. There were paintings that looked like they belonged in museums, jewelry that sparkled even in the dim flashlight beam, books so old and elaborate that they had to be worth fortunes to collectors. But other things were harder to evaluate. Ancient pottery that might be priceless archaeological finds or worthless reproductions. Gemstones that could be worth millions or could be elaborate fakes. Without expert appraisals, I had no way of knowing what I was looking at. What I did know was that Bradley and Christina were wrong. There were treasures hidden in the Whitmore estate, and Uncle Quentin had left them all to me. When I emerged from the treasure room 3 hours later, my phone had 6 missed calls, 4 from Christina and 2 from Bradley. I called Christina back. "Dad, thank God. I've been calling for hours. Where are you?" "At the mansion. Sorry, I had my phone on silent." "What are you doing up there?" I hesitated, then decided to tell her the truth. "I found the hidden room Eleanor told me about." "You found what?" "The treasure room. Christina, it's real. It's all real. There are paintings, artifacts, jewelry, books. I can't even begin to estimate what it's all worth, but it's incredible." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Dad," she finally said, "what exactly are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that Uncle Quentin left me more than just a crumbling mansion. He left me a collection that could be worth, I don't know, millions of dollars, maybe tens of millions." Another long pause. "Dad, I think you should come home. We should talk about this in person." "Christina, I know how it sounds, but Dad, please, just come home. We'll figure this out together." The drive back to Cedar Falls gave me 2 hours to think about how to handle the situation. I knew Christina and Bradley would be skeptical, and I couldn't blame them. The whole thing sounded like something from a movie. But I'd seen the treasure room with my own eyes, touched artifacts that were clearly centuries old, stood in front of paintings that belonged in the Louvre. When I arrived at their house, Bradley was already there, pacing around their living room like a caged animal. "Jerry." He grabbed my shoulders the moment I walked through the door. "Christina told me what you think you found. Walk me through it. Everything. Leave nothing out." So I told them everything. My conversation with Eleanor, the architectural plans, finding the hidden entrance, the room full of artifacts and artwork. I even showed them photos I'd taken with my phone, though the flashlight illumination made it hard to see details clearly. Bradley studied the photos with the intense concentration of a man trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Jerry, some of this stuff does look interesting, but you have to understand, the antiques market is incredibly tricky. What looks valuable to an amateur might be worthless to an expert, and what looks worthless might be priceless. Which is why I need to get proper appraisals," I said. "Absolutely." But Jerry, even if some of this stuff is valuable, restoration costs are still going to be enormous. You could have $1 million worth of antiques and still not have enough money to properly restore the mansion. Christina was looking at the photos on my phone, zooming in on various items. Dad, this is exciting, really it is. But Bradley's right about the restoration costs. Maybe the smart thing is to have everything properly appraised, sell the valuable pieces, and use that money plus the development value of the land to set yourself up for life. Sell Uncle Quentin's collection? Dad, what else are you going to do with medieval manuscripts and ancient pottery? You can't eat them, you can't live in them. If they're really valuable, sell them to people who can properly preserve and display them, then use the money to secure your future. Bradley was nodding enthusiastically. Christina's absolutely right. Jerry, if you've really discovered a significant collection, we could be talking about serious money here. Combined with the development potential of the property itself, you could be looking at, hell, I don't even want to guess. 20 million, 50 million, more? The way they kept talking about we and us was starting to grate on me, but I tried to focus on their practical arguments. They weren't wrong about the challenges of restoration or about the complexity of the antiques market. Look, Bradley continued, I've got connections with some of the top auction houses in New York. Sotheby's, Christie's, the works. If you've really found something significant, these are the people who can tell us what we're dealing with and get top dollar for it. What kind of timeline are we talking about? I asked. For proper appraisals? Probably a few weeks, maybe a month. For auction, assuming the pieces are as significant as they appear, maybe 6 months to a year. But Jerry, if we're talking about the kind of money I think we might be talking about, it's worth taking the time to do it right. Christina was looking at one particular photo on my phone, a painting of a woman in elaborate medieval dress. Dad, this looks like something you'd see in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Which is exactly why we need expert opinions, Bradley said. Jerry, I know you're emotionally attached to the idea of restoring the mansion, but think about this practically. If you're sitting on a $50 million art collection, why would you want to spend years and millions of dollars fixing up an old house? You could buy any house you wanted, anywhere in the world. That night, I lay awake thinking about their arguments. From a purely financial standpoint, they made perfect sense. If Uncle Quentin's collection was as valuable as it appeared, selling it could provide more money than I could spend in the rest of my lifetime. I could buy a comfortable house in a nice neighborhood, travel the world, maybe even set up a trust fund for any grandchildren Christina and Bradley might have someday. But something about the whole plan felt wrong. Uncle Quentin hadn't left me the collection so I could sell it to the highest bidder. He'd left it to me because he trusted me to preserve the Whitmore legacy, to bring the mansion back to life and honor the family's history. The next morning, I called Eleanor Hartwell. Mrs. Hartwell, I found the treasure room. Oh, wonderful. What did you think? It's incredible. But I need to ask you something. Do you think Uncle Quentin would have wanted me to sell the collection? She was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Caldwell, may I speak frankly? Please. Quentin spent the last years of his life watching developers circle the property like vultures, waiting for him to die so they could tear down the mansion and build condominiums. The idea of the Whitmore estate becoming just another luxury housing development broke his heart. But what about the collection? Surely he would have understood if I needed to sell some pieces to fund the restoration. Perhaps. But I think what would have mattered most to him was preserving the estate as a whole. The mansion, the grounds, the family history. The collection was never separate from the property in his mind. It was all part of the same legacy. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the architectural plans Eleanor had given me. According to her diagrams, the treasure room was only one of several hidden chambers in the mansion. There were at least 2 more concealed rooms, plus the tunnel system that might contain additional storage areas. What if what I'd found so far was only the beginning? That afternoon, I called Bradley and told him I wanted to do more exploration before bringing in outside appraisers. Jerry, why wait? The sooner we get expert opinions, the sooner we know what we're dealing with. I want to check the other hidden rooms first. If there's more stuff, I'd rather find it all before bringing in strangers. Other hidden rooms? His voice sharpened with interest. How many other rooms? Eleanor's plans show at least 2 more, plus some kind of storage areas in the tunnel system. Jesus Christ, Jerry. This is like something from a movie. When are you going back up there? Tomorrow morning. I'm coming with you. I started to object, but Bradley cut me off. Jerry, if there are multiple rooms full of valuable items, you need someone else there for security purposes. Plus, I've got experience with property assessment and documentation. We should photograph and catalog everything systematically. He had a point, though I suspected his real motivation was curiosity rather than helpfulness. Still, the idea of exploring the mansion alone was becoming less appealing, especially if there were extensive tunnel systems to investigate. Fine, I said. But we're just looking and documenting. No decisions about selling anything until I've had time to think it all through. Of course. This is your inheritance, Jerry. I'm just here to help. That evening, Christina called to make sure I was being careful. Dad, I know you're excited about all this, but please be safe up there. Those tunnels could be unstable after all these years, and some of the floors in the mansion looked pretty questionable. I'll be careful. And Dad, whatever you decide to do with the collection, I'm proud of you. Uncle Quentin obviously saw something special in you, and I think Mom would have been excited about this whole adventure. It was the first time since Sarah's death that Christina had brought up her mother in relation to something positive and forward-looking. For a moment I could almost imagine Sarah beside me, urging me to be bold and follow my instincts rather than playing it safe. Thanks, sweetheart. That means a lot. The next morning, Bradley picked me up at 7 a.m. in his expensive SUV, the back loaded with professional-grade flashlights, digital cameras, and what looked like enough documentation supplies for a museum expedition. I've been thinking about this all night, he said as we drove north. Jerry, if this collection is as significant as it seems, we're not just talking about antiques. We could be talking about historically important artifacts that belong in museums, artwork that scholars have been looking for, maybe even items that were thought to be lost forever. You think it's that important? I think your uncle's family was far more wealthy and well-connected than anyone realized, and wealthy, well-connected people in the early 1900s had access to things that would be impossible to acquire today. Original manuscripts, archaeological artifacts from before there were laws protecting them, artwork from private collections that were sold off during hard times. The mansion looked different with Bradley beside me, less like a romantic ruin and more like a potentially lucrative business opportunity. He immediately started taking photographs of the exterior, noting architectural details and structural issues with the practiced eye of someone who'd evaluated hundreds of properties. The bones of this place are solid, he said, running his hands along the foundation stones. Jerry, even if we decide to develop the property, we could potentially relocate the mansion itself. There are companies that specialize in moving historical structures. We could preserve the building while still maximizing the land value. I wasn't sure how I felt about that idea, but I let it pass without comment. We had more immediate mysteries to solve. Inside the mansion, I led Bradley directly to the library and showed him how to open the hidden door to the treasure room. His reaction was everything I'd hoped for. Stunned silence followed by a string of creative profanity. Holy shit, Jerry. This is incredible. We spent 2 hours in the treasure room, with Bradley systematically photographing every item, while I tried to provide what little information I had about the collection's history. Some pieces were clearly labeled or signed, but many others were mysteries that would require expert evaluation. Jerry, look at this painting. Bradley had found a small canvas tucked behind several larger works. It showed a rural landscape with figures working in a field, painted in a style I didn't recognize, but that looked unmistakably European and old. What about it? The signature. Look at the signature. I looked where he was pointing. In the lower right corner, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, was a signature that appeared to read, Millet. Jean-Francois Millet, Bradley said quietly. Jerry, if this is real, if this is actually an original Millet painting, we could be looking at $20 or $30 million just for this one piece. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything without expert authentication, but Millet's work sells for incredible amounts when it comes up for auction. There was a painting similar to this one that sold at Christie's 3 years ago for $42 million. I stared at the small canvas, trying to process the idea that I might be holding something worth more than most people would earn in their entire lifetimes. Bradley, there are dozens of paintings in here. I know. Jerry, I'm starting to think we might not be talking about $20 or $50 million. We might be talking about $100 million, maybe more. We found the second hidden room 2 hours later, accessed through a concealed door behind a false wall in what had once been the mansion's formal dining room. This chamber was larger than the treasure room and seemed to focus on different types of collectibles, rare books, manuscripts, scientific instruments, and what appeared to be a collection of antique jewelry that made my eyes water just looking at it. The crown jewel was a glass display case containing what looked like a complete medieval illuminated manuscript, open to a page showing an elaborate religious scene painted in gold and brilliant colors that seemed to glow even in our flashlight beams. Jerry. Bradley's voice was barely above a whisper. Do you have any idea how rare complete medieval manuscripts are? Most of them were broken up and sold page by page centuries ago. If this is authentic, if it's really a complete illuminated manuscript from the medieval period. He didn't finish the sentence, but I could see the awe in his expression. The third hidden chamber took us another hour to locate. According to Eleanor's plans, it should be accessible through the mansion's wine cellar. But the wine cellar itself was concealed behind what appeared to be a solid stone wall in the basement. There, Bradley said, studying the architectural drawings. See this marking? It indicates some kind of mechanical opening mechanism. We spent 20 minutes examining every inch of the basement wall before I found it, a loose stone that pressed inward like a button. When I pushed it, we heard the same clicking sound I'd encountered in the library, followed by the grinding of heavy machinery that hadn't operated in decades. A section of the stone wall, perhaps 6 feet wide, slowly pivoted on a central axis, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness below. Jesus Christ, Bradley breathed. Jerry, this is like something from an adventure movie. The staircase led down to a natural cave system that had been modified and expanded by human engineering. The walls were lined with stone and mortar, and electric lights had been installed at some point, though the bulbs were long dead. Our flashlights revealed a series of interconnected chambers that extended much further than Eleanor's architectural plans had suggested. The first chamber contained what was clearly the remnants of the Prohibition-era smuggling operation Eleanor had mentioned. Wooden crates stacked floor to ceiling, most of them still containing bottles of wine and liquor that were probably worth small fortunes to collectors, even if they were no longer drinkable. But it was the second chamber that made us both stop in our tracks. The room was filled with wooden crates and metal filing cabinets, all carefully labeled and organized. But these weren't wine storage containers. According to the labels, these crates contained artwork, artifacts, and documents from all over the world, items that had been collected, cataloged, and stored with museum-quality care. Jerry, look at this. Bradley was examining a metal filing cabinet filled with documentation. These are acquisition records, provenance documents, authenticity certificates. Your uncle's great-grandfather didn't just collect valuable items, he documented everything like a professional museum curator. I opened one of the wooden crates at random and found myself looking at a collection of what appeared to be ancient Egyptian artifacts, pottery, jewelry, small sculptures, all carefully wrapped and labeled with acquisition dates from the 1920s. Bradley, how is this legal? How did one family accumulate all this stuff? Different times, different laws, he said, studying the documentation. In the early 1900s, wealthy Americans could buy pretty much anything from anyone. Archaeological artifacts, artwork from declining European noble families, entire collections from estates that were being sold off. Most of the laws protecting cultural heritage didn't exist yet. Another crate contained what looked like Native American artifacts, pottery, jewelry, weapons, ceremonial items. The documentation indicated they'd been acquired from various sources throughout the American West during the 1890s and early 1900s. Jerry, some of this stuff probably belongs in the Smithsonian. We spent the next 3 hours examining crate after crate, filing cabinet after filing cabinet. The scope of the collection was staggering. Artwork from Europe, artifacts from Egypt and the Middle East, Native American cultural items, rare books and manuscripts, scientific instruments, gemstones and jewelry from around the world. And every piece was carefully documented with acquisition records, authenticity certificates, and detailed descriptions. "Look at this," Bradley said, holding up a thick folder from one of the filing cabinets. "This is a complete provenance record for a collection of Renaissance paintings that were acquired from an Italian noble family in 1923. Jerry, according to these documents, there are 6 original Renaissance paintings stored somewhere in this tunnel system. By the time we finally emerged from the underground chambers, it was past 6 p.m., and both of us were exhausted, overwhelmed, and slightly in shock." "Jerry," Bradley said as we locked up the mansion and walked back to his SUV, "I don't think either of us fully understands what you've inherited here." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we just spent 7 hours looking at what might be one of the most significant private art and artifact collections in American history. Jerry, this isn't just valuable, this is historically important. There are probably museum curators and art historians who would kill to get access to what you've got stored in those tunnels." During the drive home, Bradley was unusually quiet, clearly trying to process everything we'd seen. Finally, about halfway to Cedar Falls, he pulled the car over at a rest stop and turned to face me. "Jerry, we need to talk seriously about security." "Security?" "What we saw today. If word gets out about the scope and value of that collection, you're going to have problems. Art thieves, con artists, maybe even violent criminals who think they can force you to give them access to the tunnels." I hadn't thought about that angle, but he was right. We'd just documented evidence of what could be hundreds of millions of dollars worth of art and artifacts, all stored in a remote mansion with no security system. "What do you suggest?" "First, we don't tell anyone else about this. Not Christina, not your friends, nobody. The fewer people who know, the safer you are." "You want me to lie to Christina?" "I want you to protect her. Jerry, if the wrong people find out what you've got up there, they might try to use your family to get to you." That sobered me quickly. I'd been thinking about the collection in terms of financial opportunity and historical significance, but Bradley was right about the security implications. "Second," he continued, "we need to get professional security advice, and fast. I know a guy who specializes in protecting high-value assets. He's expensive, but he's discreet, and he's good at what he does." "How expensive?" "Jerry, if you're sitting on what I think you're sitting on, security costs are going to be a rounding error. We're talking about protecting potentially the most valuable private collection in New England." When we finally got back to Cedar Falls, Christina was waiting at my house, clearly anxious about how the day had gone. "Dad, how was it? Did you find the other rooms?" I looked at Bradley, who gave me a slight nod. "We found some interesting things," I said carefully, "but it's going to take more time to properly evaluate everything." "What kind of interesting things?" "Just more of the same, really. Artwork, antiques, family documents. Bradley thinks we should get professional appraisers involved before we make any decisions." Christina looked between us, clearly sensing that there was more to the story than we were telling her. "Dad, you both look like you've seen ghosts. What aren't you telling me?" "Honey," Bradley said, putting his arm around her, "your dad's inheritance is more significant than any of us realized. We just want to be careful about how we handle the next steps." "More significant how?" "We won't know for sure until we get expert appraisals," I said. "But it's possible that the collection is worth more than we initially thought." "How much more?" Bradley and I exchanged another look. "A lot more," Bradley said finally. That night, after Christina and Bradley left, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by the photographs we'd taken throughout the day. In the artificial light of my house, with the normal sounds of suburban life around me, the whole experience felt almost surreal. Had I really spent the day exploring secret tunnels and examining artifacts that might be worth hundreds of millions of dollars? Had I really inherited a collection that could make me one of the wealthiest people in New England? More importantly, what was I supposed to do with it all? Bradley's arguments about security were compelling. The practical challenges of preserving and protecting such an extensive collection were enormous. Maybe the smart thing really was to work with auction houses and museums to find appropriate buyers for the most significant pieces. But as I looked at the photographs of Uncle Quentin's carefully preserved collection, I kept thinking about Eleanor's words. The collection was never separate from the property in his mind. It was all part of the same legacy. Uncle Quentin hadn't spent his life assembling this incredible collection just so it could be sold off piece by piece after his death. He'd preserved it, protected it, and ultimately entrusted it to me because he believed I would understand its value beyond mere dollars and cents. The question was, did I have the courage to honor that trust? 3 days later, everything changed again. Bradley had arranged for his security consultant to meet us at the mansion, a serious, soft-spoken man named Vincent Torres, who specialized in protecting high-value collections for wealthy families and institutions. Vincent had spent 20 years with the FBI's art crime team before starting his own consulting firm, and his reputation for discretion and expertise was apparently legendary in certain circles. Before we discuss security measures, Vincent said as we sat in the mansion's dust-covered parlor, I need to understand exactly what we're protecting. Mr. Bradley has given me a general overview, but I'd like to see the collection myself. So we took him on the same tour Bradley and I had experienced 3 days earlier, the treasure room, the second hidden chamber, and finally down into the tunnel system where the bulk of the collection was stored. Vincent's reaction was different from ours. He didn't gasp or curse or show any visible excitement. Instead, he moved through the chambers with the methodical precision of someone conducting a professional investigation, taking notes on a digital tablet and occasionally photographing specific items that caught his attention. Gentlemen, he said after we'd spent 2 hours showing him through the collection, I need to make some phone calls. Phone calls? There are items down here that I recognize from FBI databases. Not as stolen property, he added quickly, seeing our alarm, but as culturally significant artifacts that various institutions have been trying to locate for decades. Vincent stepped outside to make his calls while Bradley and I waited nervously in the mansion's foyer. Jerry, what if some of this stuff is stolen? It's not stolen. We saw the acquisition records. Uncle Quentin's great-grandfather bought everything legally. Legally by 1920 standards. But some countries have been demanding the return of archaeological artifacts that were taken before their heritage protection laws existed. When Vincent came back inside 20 minutes later, his expression was unreadable. Gentlemen, I've just spoken with colleagues at the Smithsonian, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the FBI's current art crime team. What you have here is unprecedented. Unprecedented how? I asked. Mr. Caldwell, your family's collection contains items that scholars have been looking for since World War II. There are Egyptian artifacts down there that were thought to be lost forever. Medieval manuscripts that exist in only 2 or 3 copies worldwide. Native American ceremonial items that are the only known examples of their type. Bradley leaned forward. Vincent, cut to the chase. What are we looking at in terms of value? Mr. Bradley, this collection is essentially priceless. If it were broken up and sold at auction, it would probably bring between $250 and $400 million. But its historical and cultural value is incalculable. $250 to $400 million. The numbers hit me like a physical blow. However, Vincent continued, there are some complicating factors we need to discuss. What kind of complications? First, several governments have expressed interest in repatriating items from your collection. The Egyptian government, in particular, has been trying to recover artifacts that left the country during the colonial period. They're not claiming the items were stolen, but they are requesting that significant pieces be returned for display in Egyptian museums. They want me to just give them back? Not give them back, necessarily, but there could be diplomatic pressure to negotiate some kind of arrangement. The good news is that such negotiations often result in very generous compensation, sometimes more than the items would bring at auction. And the other complications? Vincent hesitated. Mr. Caldwell, news of a discovery like this doesn't stay secret for long. My phone calls this afternoon have already generated considerable interest in museum and academic circles. Within a few weeks, you're going to have art historians, museum curators, government representatives, and reporters all trying to get access to your property. Shit, Bradley muttered. Jerry, this is exactly what I was worried about. Which brings us to the security question, Vincent continued. Protecting a collection of this scope and value is not something you can handle with a simple alarm system. You're going to need professional security, climate control systems to preserve the artifacts, and probably some kind of public access plan to manage scholarly and institutional interest. Public access plan? Mr. Caldwell, you now own one of the most significant private art and artifact collections in American history. The academic and museum communities are going to want to study these items. You can try to keep everything private, but that's going to generate pressure and possibly legal challenges from institutions that believe culturally significant items should be accessible to scholars and the public. I looked around the mansion's crumbling foyer, trying to imagine it filled with art historians and museum curators. Vincent, what would you recommend? Honestly, I'd recommend working with a major museum to establish some kind of partnership arrangement. They provide security, conservation, and scholarly access, while you retain ownership and receive income from exhibition fees and research grants. What kind of income are we talking about? Depending on the arrangement, potentially millions per year. Major museums pay substantial fees for the right to display and study significant private collections. Bradley was nodding enthusiastically. Jerry, that could be the perfect solution. You keep ownership of everything, but you don't have to deal with the day-to-day management and security issues. But what about the mansion? What about Uncle Quentin's wish to preserve the family legacy? Vincent smiled for the first time since we'd met him. Mr. Caldwell, there's no reason the mansion couldn't be part of the arrangement. In fact, several museums have expressed interest in funding the complete restoration of historical properties to serve as exhibition spaces for significant collections. You mean restore the mansion and use it as a museum? I mean restore the mansion to museum quality standards and use it to display your collection in its original context. Visitors would see the artifacts and artwork in the same environment where they were originally collected and preserved. For the first time in weeks, I could see a path forward that honored both Uncle Quentin's wishes and the practical realities of managing such an incredible inheritance. Over the next hour, Vincent outlined what such an arrangement might look like. The Smithsonian, the Met, and several other major institutions would be interested in forming partnerships that could provide funding for the mansion's restoration, ongoing security and conservation, scholarly access, and public exhibitions. The key, Vincent explained, is that you would retain ownership of everything while receiving substantial compensation for providing access. It's not uncommon for such arrangements to generate $5 to $10 million per year in income for the property owner. $5 to $10 million per year. From a collection I'd inherited 3 weeks ago from an uncle I barely knew. Vincent, how long would it take to set up something like that? Negotiations with major museums move slowly, but given the significance of your collection, I'd expect serious offers within 60 to 90 days. The restoration work would take longer, probably 2 to 3 years to properly restore the mansion and install museum-quality security and climate control systems. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we implement emergency security measures to protect the collection, and you start having conversations with museum directors and art historians to determine which institution would be the best fit for a long-term partnership. When Vincent left that afternoon, he took with him detailed photographs and documentation of the most significant items in the collection, along with authorization to begin preliminary discussions with major museums and cultural institutions. Bradley was practically vibrating with excitement as we drove back to Cedar Falls. Jerry, do you realize what just happened? You're going to be rich. Not just comfortable, not just well off. You're going to be genuinely, seriously rich. If everything works out the way Vincent thinks it will, it's going to work out. Jesus Christ, Jerry, you're looking at potentially $100 million in total value, plus millions per year in ongoing income. You could buy any house you want, travel anywhere in the world, set up trust funds for your grandchildren's grandchildren. But as we drove through the New England countryside, past farms and small towns that looked like they hadn't changed in decades, I found myself thinking less about the money and more about the responsibility. Uncle Quentin had spent decades preserving and protecting a collection that represented centuries of human creativity and cultural achievement. Now that responsibility had passed to me, and the decisions I made in the coming months would determine whether that collection continued to be preserved for future generations or was scattered to private collectors and lost to scholarship forever. That evening I called Christina to tell her about Vincent's assessment. Dad, I can't even process this. Are you telling me you're going to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars? I'm telling you that Uncle Quentin left me something more valuable than any of us imagined. What does this mean for your plans? Are you still thinking about restoring the mansion? More than ever. Christina, Vincent thinks I could arrange a partnership with a major museum that would fund the restoration and turn the property into a world-class exhibition space. A museum? Dad, that sounds incredible. It would be incredible. Imagine the mansion restored to its original glory, filled with the most significant private art and artifact collection in New England, open to scholars and the public. It would be a way to honor Uncle Quentin's memory while sharing the collection with the world. For the first time since I'd inherited the property, Christina sounded genuinely excited about my plans rather than worried about the practical challenges. Dad, I'm proud of you. This is going to be amazing. Over the next 2 weeks, Vincent arranged meetings with representatives from 5 major museums and cultural institutions. Each meeting followed the same pattern: initial skepticism, followed by careful examination of our documentation, followed by intense interest, and preliminary discussions about partnership arrangements. The offers that began coming in exceeded even Vincent's optimistic projections. The Smithsonian was interested in a partnership that would provide $12 million for the mansion's restoration, plus $4 million per year for ongoing access to the collection. The Metropolitan Museum of Art offered $15 million for restoration, plus $6 million per year, but wanted the right to relocate certain pieces to their New York facilities for major exhibitions. Yale University, working in partnership with several smaller institutions, proposed the most ambitious arrangement: $22 million for restoration and the creation of a dedicated research center, plus $8 million per year for exclusive scholarly access, with the understanding that the mansion would become a world-renowned center for the study of historical collecting practices and cultural preservation. But it was the 4th meeting that changed everything. Dr. Amanda Richardson was the director of acquisitions for the Gardner Museum in Boston, and she arrived at the mansion on a rainy Tuesday morning with a small team of experts and a very different kind of proposal. Mr. Caldwell, she said as we stood in the mansion's grand foyer, I've spent my entire career studying private collections, and I've never encountered anything quite like what you've inherited. She was a small, intense woman in her 50s with the kind of focused energy that suggested she was used to getting exactly what she wanted. Her team included a Renaissance art expert, a medieval manuscript specialist, and someone whose job title was simply Senior Antiquities Consultant. What makes it different? I asked. The scope, the quality, and most importantly, the documentation. Most private collections from this era were assembled haphazardly, with minimal record-keeping. But your great-great-uncle appears to have approached collecting with the systematic precision of a professional museum curator. Dr. Richardson's team spent 6 hours examining the collection, and their excitement was palpable. The Renaissance art expert identified 3 paintings that he believed were previously unknown works by major masters. The manuscript specialist nearly fainted when she saw the complete medieval illuminated manuscript, declaring it to be one of the most significant discoveries in medieval studies in the past 50 years. But it was the antiquities consultant who made the discovery that changed everything. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, emerging from the tunnel system with a small wooden box in his hands, "where exactly did your ancestor acquire the Egyptian collection?" "According to the records, from various sources between 1920 and 1925. Why?" He opened the wooden box, revealing what looked like an elaborate golden necklace encrusted with gems and intricate hieroglyphic inscriptions. "Because this piece wasn't supposed to exist anymore." "What do you mean?" "This is a ceremonial collar that belonged to a high priest of Amun during the New Kingdom period, probably around 1300 BC. It was documented in Howard Carter's notes from the Valley of the Kings excavations, but it disappeared from the archaeological record in 1924. Dr. Richardson was studying the necklace with intense concentration. "Are you telling me this is the lost collar from tomb KV-64? "I'm telling you this matches Carter's descriptions exactly, down to the specific arrangement of the hieroglyphic inscriptions. If this is authentic, and preliminary examination suggests it is, we're looking at one of the most significant Egyptian artifacts in private hands." "How significant?" I asked. "Mr. Caldwell, this single piece could be worth $50 million or more to the right buyer, but its historical significance is beyond measure. This collar represents direct evidence of New Kingdom religious practices that scholars have been trying to understand for a century." Dr. Richardson was already pulling out her phone. "I need to call the Egyptian Ministry of Culture immediately. Mr. Caldwell, are you aware that several governments have been searching for this particular artifact for decades? Over the next 4 hours, our quiet assessment meeting turned into something resembling a conference call with half the archaeological world. Dr. Richardson contacted colleagues at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, specialists at Oxford and Cambridge, and representatives from UNESCO's Cultural Heritage Division. The consensus was unanimous. The collection contained items of international cultural significance that had been missing from the scholarly record for decades. "Mr. Caldwell," Dr. Richardson said as her team prepared to leave, "I'm going to be very direct with you. What you've inherited here isn't just valuable, it's historically crucial. There are items in your collection that could revolutionize our understanding of ancient cultures, medieval art, and early American collecting practices." "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that you allow the Gardner Museum to coordinate a comprehensive scholarly assessment of the entire collection, in partnership with international experts and cultural institutions. We would fund the complete restoration of the mansion, provide world-class security and conservation, and establish the Whitmore Estate as a premier research center for historical collecting studies. And in return, you would receive an initial payment of $30 million, plus $12 million per year in perpetuity, plus a percentage of any revenue generated by publications, documentaries, or educational programs based on the collection. $30 million up front, plus $12 million per year forever. Even accounting for taxes, it was more money than I could spend in several lifetimes." "Dr. Richardson, I appreciate the offer, but I need time to think about it." "Of course, but Mr. Caldwell, I should mention that word of this discovery is going to spread quickly through academic circles. Other institutions will be making offers soon, and some of them may be less committed to preserving the collection's integrity and historical context." That evening, I called Christina and Bradley to my house for a family meeting. I'd decided it was time to tell them the full truth about what Uncle Quentin had left me. When I explained about the meetings with museum representatives and the offers that were being made, Christina just stared at me in silence. "Dad," she finally said, "did you just tell me that you're going to receive $30 million up front, plus $12 million every year for the rest of your life?" "That's one of the offers, yes." Bradley was doing rapid calculations on his phone. "Jerry, $12 million per year. At your age, even if you only live another 20 years, we're talking about almost $300 million in total value." "We?" The word came out sharper than I'd intended, and Bradley immediately realized his mistake. "Sorry, you. I meant you're looking at almost $300 million. But the damage was done. For weeks, Bradley had been talking about our development plans and our potential profits, despite the fact that he had no legal claim to any of Uncle Quentin's inheritance. Now, faced with numbers so large they were hard to comprehend, his true feelings were becoming clear. "Bradley," I said carefully, "what exactly do you think your role should be in all this?" "Well, I've been helping with the research and evaluation. I introduced you to Vincent. I've been handling communications with the various institutions." "You've been helping," I agreed, "and I'm grateful for that. But this is my inheritance." "Of course it is. Jerry, I'm not trying to claim ownership of anything. I'm just saying, maybe there should be some kind of compensation for the work I've put in. I've essentially been acting as your project manager for the past month." Christina was looking uncomfortable, clearly sensing the tension that was building between us. "What kind of compensation did you have in mind?" I asked. "I don't know. 10%? 15? Something fair that reflects the value I've added to the process. 10% of $300 million. $30 million for a month of making phone calls and taking photographs." "Bradley," I said, keeping my voice level, "I appreciate everything you've done, but I'm not giving you 15% of my inheritance." His face flushed red. "Jerry, be reasonable. Without my connections and expertise, you'd still be wandering around that house with a flashlight, trying to figure out what you were looking at. I figured out how to find the hidden rooms before you ever got involved. You found one room. I'm the one who insisted we do systematic documentation. I'm the one who brought in Vincent Torres. I'm the one who's been managing communications with all these museums and institutions. And I'm the one who inherited the collection from my uncle." The argument escalated from there. Bradley accused me of being ungrateful and short-sighted. I accused him of trying to profit from someone else's inheritance. Christina tried to mediate, but she was clearly torn between supporting her husband and acknowledging that his demands were unreasonable. "Dad," she said finally, "maybe there's some middle ground here. Bradley has done a lot of work, and he does have valuable expertise. Maybe not 15%, but something to acknowledge his contribution?" "Like what?" "I don't know. 5%? Or maybe you could hire Bradley's company to handle the ongoing management of the museum partnership?" I looked at both of them, seeing the naked greed in Bradley's eyes and the conflicted loyalty in Christina's expression. For the first time since inheriting the property, I felt truly alone. "I need time to think about all this," I said. "Time to think?" Bradley's voice was rising. "Jerry, we've got institutions offering you hundreds of millions of dollars and you need time to think? What exactly is there to think about?" "About what Uncle Quentin would have wanted. About what the right thing to do is. The right thing to do is to secure your family's financial future," Bradley was shouting now. "Jerry, you're 62 years old. This is your chance to leave Christina and your future grandchildren set for life. By giving you $30 million for a month of work? By recognizing that I'm the reason you're looking at a $300 million windfall instead of a $1 million development deal?" "Bradley, stop it." Christina's voice cut through our argument. "Dad, he's upset and he's not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking perfectly clearly," Bradley snapped. "Your father is about to become one of the richest men in Connecticut, and he's acting like I'm trying to rob him by asking for fair compensation." "Fair compensation for what?" I asked. "Bradley, you invited yourself into this project. You insisted on getting involved. I never asked for your help, and I certainly never promised you a percentage of anything. I've been working on this for a month. You've been working on this because you saw an opportunity to make money from my inheritance." The truth hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Bradley's face went through several emotions before settling on cold anger. "You know what, Jerry? Fine. Keep your precious inheritance. But don't come crying to me when you realize you're in over your head." He stormed out of my house, leaving Christina and me staring at each other in uncomfortable silence. "Dad," she said finally, "he's really upset. I noticed. He's been talking about this collection like it was going to solve all our financial problems. We've been having some difficulties with his business, and the idea of a major windfall was really appealing to him." It was the first time Christina had admitted that Bradley's development company might not be as successful as he liked everyone to believe. "Sweetheart, I'm sorry that you're having financial problems, but Uncle Quentin's inheritance can't be the solution to Bradley's business issues." "I know that. But Dad, maybe there's some way to help. I mean, if you're really going to be receiving millions of dollars per year." Even Christina was starting to see my inheritance as a solution to her family's problems rather than as my personal legacy from Uncle Quentin. "Let me ask you something," I said. "If I give Bradley a percentage of the inheritance, or if I help bail out his business, what happens if the museum partnership doesn't work out? What happens if the collection turns out to be worth less than we think? What happens if there are legal challenges or repatriation demands that tie everything up in courts for years?" Christina looked uncomfortable. I don't know. Because once I start handing out money based on optimistic projections, there's no taking it back. If this whole thing falls apart, I'll have given away my security for nothing." "But Dad, the experts seem pretty confident about the value." "Experts can be wrong. Markets can change. Legal situations can get complicated. Christina, the only thing I know for certain is that Uncle Quentin left me this collection because he trusted me to preserve it and honor the family legacy. Everything else is speculation." After Christina left that night, I sat in my kitchen reading Uncle Quentin's letter for probably the 20th time. His words about preserving the Whitmore legacy and not letting developers tear down the mansion felt more relevant than ever. But he'd also written about family, about the importance of respect and genuine relationships. Had he intended for me to share the inheritance with Christina? Had he expected me to help my family financially? The next morning, I drove back to Millbrook County alone. I needed to spend time in the mansion without Bradley's constant commentary or Christina's worried questions. I needed to think clearly about what Uncle Quentin really would have wanted. The mansion felt different on this visit, less like a ruin and more like a sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. I walked through the rooms slowly, imagining them restored to their original grandeur, filled with Uncle Quentin's carefully preserved collection. In the library, I found something I'd missed on previous visits, a small leather journal tucked behind some books on a high shelf. The journal was filled with Uncle Quentin's handwriting, chronicling his thoughts and experiences during his final years. Most of the entries were mundane observations about daily life, weather, or memories of Margaret. But one entry, dated just 6 months before his death, caught my attention. "Jeremiah visited for Sarah's funeral today. 40 years since I last saw him, and he's exactly what I expected. Steady, honest, respectful. No demands for money, no questions about the estate, just genuine condolence and human decency. I've been thinking about what will happen to this place after I'm gone. The vultures will circle immediately. Developers, distant relatives who ignored me for decades, people who see only dollar signs where I see family history. But Jeremiah is different. He has the skills to restore this house and the character to preserve what it represents. More importantly, he understands the difference between price and value. I think I'll leave him everything. It's a terrible burden, but it's also an incredible opportunity. He'll face pressure to sell, to compromise, to take the easy path. But if he can resist that pressure, if he can see past the immediate financial temptation to the larger legacy, he could create something truly magnificent. The collection deserves to be preserved and shared, not scattered to private buyers who will lock it away in climate-controlled storage. The mansion deserves to live again, not be torn down for condominiums. Jeremiah has spent his life building things. Now he can build something that will last for generations. Reading Uncle Quentin's private thoughts about my character and his hopes for the estate was both humbling and inspiring. He'd chosen me not because I was the most qualified person to manage a museum-quality collection, but because he believed I would make decisions based on legacy rather than profit. That afternoon, I called Dr. Richardson and accepted the Gardner Museum's partnership proposal. "Mr. Caldwell, I think you're making an excellent decision. We'll begin the restoration planning immediately, and I'll start assembling the scholarly team that will oversee the collection assessment and cataloging. Dr. Richardson, there's one condition I want to add to our agreement. What's that? I want Uncle Quentin's name prominently featured in all materials about the collection and the museum. This isn't the Caldwell collection. It's the Quentin Whitmore collection, assembled by the Whitmore family over 5 generations. Of course. Mr. Caldwell, that's exactly the kind of historical context that makes this partnership so valuable. When I called Christina that evening to tell her about my decision, her reaction was everything I'd hoped for. Dad, that's incredible. The Gardner Museum, that's one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. It feels right, Christina. It honors Uncle Quentin's memory while making the collection accessible to scholars and the public. And Dad, I'm sorry about Bradley. He was wrong to demand a percentage of your inheritance. This is your legacy, and you should make decisions based on what feels right to you. What about your financial problems? We'll figure something out. Bradley's business has had some setbacks, but we're not in any real danger. And honestly, knowing that you're going to be financially secure for the rest of your life is worth more to me than any amount of money. It was the most mature conversation Christina and I had ever had about money and family, and I felt closer to her than I had since Sarah's death. But Bradley's reaction to the news was explosive. He showed up at my house the next morning, clearly furious and barely controlling his temper. Jerry, what the hell do you think you're doing? I'm making decisions about my inheritance. Your inheritance that I spent a month helping you evaluate and develop. Your inheritance that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars because of the work I put in. Bradley, you didn't create the collection. You didn't even discover it. You took some photographs and made some phone calls. I brought in Vincent Torres. I managed communications with all the museums. Jerry, without my involvement, you'd probably have accepted the first lowball offer that came along. Maybe. Or maybe I would have figured things out on my own, just like I figured out how to find the hidden rooms. You want to know what I think? Bradley was pacing around my living room like a caged animal. I think you're making a huge mistake. I think the Gardner Museum is taking advantage of an old man who doesn't understand the full value of what he's inherited. The Gardner Museum is offering me $30 million up front plus $12 million per year. How is that taking advantage? Because you could get twice that much if you sold the collection at auction. Jerry, you're literally leaving hundreds of millions of dollars on the table because you're too sentimental to make hard business decisions. Or maybe I'm making a decision based on something more important than maximizing profit. Like what? Like some romantic fantasy about honoring your uncle's memory? Jerry, your uncle lived like a hermit in a falling-down mansion for the last decade of his life. You think that's the legacy he wanted to preserve? I think he wanted to preserve the collection and the family history, which is exactly what I'm doing. Bradley stopped pacing and stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, pure, undisguised contempt. You know what, Jerry? I was wrong about you. I thought you were just a simple construction worker who didn't understand sophisticated financial planning. But you're worse than that. You're a selfish old man who's too proud to admit he needs help. Bradley. No, let me finish. Christina has been worried sick about your financial future since Sarah died. She's been losing sleep, trying to figure out how to take care of you as you get older. And now, when you finally have a chance to secure both your future and hers, you're throwing it away because of some misguided sense of obligation to a dead man who barely spoke to you for 40 years. Uncle Quentin left me this inheritance because he trusted my judgment. Maybe you should try doing the same. Your judgment? Bradley laughed bitterly. Jerry, your judgment got you a 2-bedroom house in Cedar Falls and a pension that barely covers your grocery bills. Forgive me if I'm not impressed by your financial wisdom. The insult hit exactly where Bradley intended it to hit. I'd spent my entire adult life working with my hands, building things, solving practical problems. I'd never had Bradley's education or business sophistication, and he knew that my working-class background was something I was sometimes sensitive about. But instead of feeling ashamed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, absolute clarity about who I was and what I valued. You're right, I said calmly. My judgment got me a modest house and a modest retirement. But it also got me 40 years of honest work, a marriage to a woman who loved me, and the respect of my community. Most importantly, it got me the trust of an eccentric millionaire who could have left his fortune to anyone but chose to leave it to me. Jerry, I'm not finished. Bradley, you've made it very clear that you think I'm too old, too poor, and too stupid to make good decisions about this inheritance. You've demanded compensation for help I never asked for, accused me of being selfish for not sharing an inheritance I earned through 40 years of treating people with respect, and insulted my intelligence and my character. Bradley's expression was shifting from anger to something that might have been concern. So here's my decision, I continued. I'm accepting the Gardner Museum's offer. I'm going to restore Uncle Quentin's mansion and turn it into a world-class research center that will preserve his collection for generations. And I'm going to do it without any help from you. Jerry, I think you're making a mistake, but... And Bradley? If you ever speak to me the way you just spoke to me again, if you ever insult my background or my intelligence again, you won't be welcome in my life anymore. Christina can visit me anytime she wants, but you'll need to find somewhere else to be during those visits. The silence that followed was deafening. Bradley opened his mouth several times as if to respond, then apparently thought better of it and left without another word. Christina called me 2 hours later, crying, "Dad, I'm so sorry." Bradley was completely out of line. Yes, he was. He's under a lot of stress with his business problems, but that's no excuse for talking to you that way. Christina, I need you to understand something. I love you more than anything in the world, but I won't tolerate anyone, including your husband, treating me with disrespect because they think I'm too old or too poor to make my own decisions. I understand. And Dad, I think you're making the right choice with the Gardner Museum. Uncle Quentin would be proud. Over the next 2 months, the restoration planning proceeded exactly as Dr. Richardson had promised. Teams of architects, conservators, and specialists descended on the mansion to assess every detail of the required work. The Gardner Museum arranged for temporary, climate-controlled storage for the most fragile items in the collection, while the restoration was underway. The media attention was overwhelming at first. News of the discovery made headlines in newspapers and art magazines across the country. Connecticut man inherits $300 million art collection. Lost Egyptian artifacts discovered in New England mansion. The greatest private collection find in American history. But Dr. Richardson and her team managed the publicity expertly, providing just enough information to satisfy public curiosity while protecting my privacy and the collection's security. I gave one carefully controlled interview to the Hartford Courant and let the Gardner Museum handle all other media requests. The restoration work began in earnest that spring. Watching teams of craftsmen and specialists slowly bring the mansion back to life was like watching a miracle unfold in slow motion. Room by room, floor by floor, the Whitmore estate was returning to its original grandeur. The workers weren't just repairing damage. They were restoring every architectural detail to museum-quality standards. The hand-carved stonework was cleaned and sealed. The exotic hardwood floors were refinished to their original luster. The elaborate Victorian-era decorative elements were painstakingly restored by specialists who understood techniques that had been largely forgotten for a century. Bradley kept his distance during this period, though I occasionally heard from Christina that he was following the project's progress and seemed genuinely impressed by what was being accomplished. He keeps saying he can't believe how much work is being done, Christina told me during one of our weekly dinners. Dad, when this is finished, it's going to be absolutely magnificent. How are things between you and Bradley? She hesitated. Better. He was really embarrassed about how he acted, and he's been trying to make up for it. He started seeing a therapist to work on his anger and stress management. That's good. Dad, I think he'd like to apologize to you, but he's not sure you'd want to hear from him. I thought about that. Bradley had behaved badly, but he was still my son-in-law, still Christina's husband, still someone who would be part of my life whether I liked it or not. Tell him he can call me, I said. I'm not ready to forget what happened, but I'm willing to listen. Bradley called 2 days later. Jerry, I owe you an enormous apology. Yes, you do. I was way out of line, and I said things that were completely unacceptable. I let my own financial stress and my excitement about the collection cloud my judgment about what was appropriate. Bradley, the money was never the issue. The issue was respect. I know. And Jerry, I want you to know that I respect the hell out of what you're doing with the restoration and the museum partnership. It's the right decision, and it's exactly what Uncle Quentin would have wanted. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was sincere enough that I was willing to accept it. Bradley, I appreciate that. And I want you to know that there will be opportunities for you to be involved with the museum project if you're interested. Dr. Richardson mentioned that they'll need local expertise for ongoing property management and development around the estate. Really? Really. But as a paid consultant, not as a partner expecting percentages of my inheritance. Jerry, that would be incredible. And I promise, no more demands for compensation I haven't earned. 6 months later, I was standing in the Whitmore Estate's restored grand foyer, wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly pension, watching the Gardner Museum's board of directors and various dignitaries tour the completed restoration. The mansion was absolutely magnificent. Every room had been restored to museum quality standards, with the hidden chambers now seamlessly integrated into the public tour route. The collection was displayed in custom-designed cases that protected the artifacts while allowing visitors to fully appreciate their beauty and historical significance. The opening ceremony was attended by representatives from the Smithsonian, the Metropolitan Museum, Yale University, Harvard, and cultural institutions from around the world. The governor of Connecticut cut the ribbon officially designating the Whitmore Estate as a National Historic Landmark and International Research Center. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Richardson said in her opening remarks, the Quentin Whitmore collection represents one of the most significant discoveries in American cultural history. Thanks to the vision and generosity of Mr. Jeremiah Caldwell, these treasures will be preserved and accessible to scholars and the public for generations to come. As I stood there listening to speeches about cultural preservation and historical legacy, I thought about Uncle Quentin and how proud he would have been to see his family's collection being honored in such a magnificent setting. But the moment that made everything worthwhile came during the private reception after the opening ceremony. Bradley approached me as I was standing in the restored treasure room, now fitted with museum-quality lighting that made the artwork glow like something from a cathedral. Jerry, he said quietly, I owe you another apology. For what? For not understanding what you were trying to accomplish. I kept thinking about this project in terms of money and business opportunities, but standing here now, seeing what you've created, this isn't about money at all, is it? I looked around the room, taking in the carefully restored Victorian architecture, the expertly displayed artifacts, the visitors who were studying Uncle Quentin's collection with wonder and respect. No, I said. It's not about money. It's about legacy. About preserving something important and sharing it with the world. Something like that. Bradley was quiet for a long moment, studying a medieval manuscript that was displayed in a climate-controlled case near the room's center. Jerry, I want you to know that I understand now why Uncle Quentin chose you for this. It wasn't about your construction skills or your practical knowledge, it was about your character. Bradley, no. Let me finish. I've spent my whole career focused on maximizing profit and financial returns. When I looked at this place, all I could see was development potential and investment opportunities. But you saw what it could become if someone cared enough to preserve it properly. He gestured around the restored room. This is what vision looks like. This is what happens when someone makes decisions based on legacy rather than just profit. 3 months after the museum's official opening, I received my first annual income payment from the Gardner Museum. $12 million exactly as promised. The check was so large that I had to call my bank to warn them it was coming, and even then, the deposit triggered several security protocols. But more rewarding than the money were the letters I began receiving from scholars, students, and visitors who had been touched by the collection. Art history professors wrote to thank me for making historically significant pieces accessible for study. Graduate students sent photographs of themselves working with manuscripts that were crucial to their research. Families wrote to describe how visiting the mansion had inspired their children to become interested in history and archaeology. Uncle Quentin's collection was no longer hidden away in secret chambers. It was alive again, serving its intended purpose of educating and inspiring people from around the world. 6 months later, Christina called me with news that put everything in perspective. "Dad, I'm pregnant." "Christina, that's wonderful. It's a girl. We're going to name her Sarah, after Mom." As I sat in my kitchen that evening, thinking about my future granddaughter and the legacy Uncle Quentin had entrusted to me, I realized that the most valuable thing I'd inherited wasn't the collection, or the money, or even the restored mansion. It was the opportunity to create something meaningful, something that would outlast my own life and benefit generations of people I would never meet. Little Sarah would grow up in a world where her grandfather was known not as a simple construction worker, but as the man who preserved and shared one of the most important cultural collections in American history. She would visit the Whitmore estate and see her family name on plaques and displays, understanding that she came from people who valued legacy over profit and chose to build rather than simply consume. But the story wasn't over yet. In fact, the most shocking discovery was still to come. It happened on a routine visit to the mansion 8 months after the museum's opening. I was meeting with Dr. Richardson and her conservation team to discuss some minor climate control adjustments when one of the workers made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about Uncle Quentin's collection. "Mr. Caldwell," called out Jensen Murphy, a restoration specialist who was working on some water damage in the mansion's basement. "Could you come take a look at this?" Jensen had been investigating moisture problems behind a stone wall in the deepest level of the basement when he'd noticed that the wall wasn't solid stone as it appeared. Instead, it was a carefully constructed facade covering what appeared to be another hidden chamber. "Sir, I think there's one more room that we missed during the original exploration." Dr. Richardson and I followed Jensen down to the basement where he'd already begun carefully removing the facade stones to reveal a heavy wooden door behind them. "This door wasn't on any of the architectural plans," Dr. Richardson observed. "It must have been added later, possibly as a private vault." The door was secured with an elaborate lock that looked like something from a bank vault, but Jensen had found the key hanging on a nail behind a loose stone, along with a note in Uncle Quentin's handwriting. For Jeremiah, the real treasure was always hidden deepest. When we opened the door, our flashlights revealed something that none of us had expected. The chamber was filled with modern safes and security deposit boxes, all carefully labeled and organized. But these weren't additional art storage containers. According to the labels, these safes contained financial instruments, legal documents, and what Uncle Quentin's notes described as the liquid portion of the Whitmore legacy. "Dr. Richardson," I said, my voice barely steady, "I think we need to call Vincent Torres." Vincent arrived 3 hours later with a team that included a financial specialist and a lawyer who specialized in estate planning. What they found in Uncle Quentin's hidden vault made the art collection look like a modest inheritance. Stock certificates dating back to the 1920s, many for companies that had become modern corporate giants. Bearer bonds that had been accumulating interest for decades. Real estate deeds for properties in Manhattan, Boston, and Washington, D.C. that Uncle Quentin had quietly acquired over the years. Bank account information for institutions in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands. "Mr. Caldwell," the financial specialist said after spending 4 hours reviewing Uncle Quentin's documents, "your uncle was far wealthier than anyone realized." "How wealthy?" "It's going to take weeks to properly evaluate everything. But based on preliminary assessment, we're looking at liquid assets worth approximately $250 million, plus real estate holdings that could be worth another $100 million or more. $250 million in cash and investments, separate from the art collection that was already generating $12 million per year in income." "Jesus Christ," I breathed. "Why did he live like a hermit if he had this kind of money?" Vincent had been studying Uncle Quentin's personal notes about the vault contents. According to these documents, he was terrified of attracting attention from people who might try to take advantage of his wealth. He'd seen too many wealthy families destroyed by people who were supposed to protect their interests. So he just hoarded money? He invested it very carefully and very quietly. Mr. Caldwell, your uncle was apparently a financial genius. Some of these investment strategies are incredibly sophisticated. He was buying and holding stocks in companies like Apple and Microsoft, decades before they became household names. Dr. Richardson was reading through Uncle Quentin's financial records with fascination. Mr. Caldwell, this explains how he was able to maintain the collection so carefully. He had the resources to provide museum-quality storage and conservation, even while letting the mansion itself deteriorate. But why let the mansion deteriorate if he had the money to maintain it? Vincent found the answer in Uncle Quentin's personal notes. Visible wealth attracts unwanted attention. A crumbling mansion protects the real treasures better than any security system. Uncle Quentin had deliberately allowed the mansion to appear worthless while secretly preserving both his collection and his fortune in hidden chambers that no one else knew existed. It was the ultimate long-term security strategy, executed by a man who understood that the greatest treasures are often the ones nobody knows you have. Over the next month, teams of financial experts worked to fully evaluate Uncle Quentin's hidden assets. The final tally was staggering: $337 million in liquid investments, plus real estate holdings worth an additional $93 million. Combined with the value of the art collection and the ongoing income from the museum partnership, Uncle Quentin had left me an inheritance worth more than $500 million. The news made international headlines. Construction worker inherits $500 million fortune. The greatest hidden fortune in American history. From modest retirement to mega millionaire. But for me, the most meaningful moment came when I called Christina to tell her the full scope of what Uncle Quentin had left us. "Dad," she said after I'd explained about the hidden vault and the financial records, "I can't even process numbers that large. Neither can I, honestly. What are you going to do with it all?" "I'm going to do what Uncle Quentin would have wanted. I'm going to use it responsibly." "What does that mean?" "It means setting up trust funds for you and little Sarah that will provide financial security for generations. It means establishing a foundation to support historical preservation and educational programs. It means making sure that the Whitmore legacy continues to benefit people long after I'm gone." "Dad, that's incredible. But what about you? What do you want?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. "I want to restore the carriage house and live on the estate. I want to be involved with the museum and the research center. I want to spend my remaining years surrounded by beautiful things, working on meaningful projects, and honoring the trust that Uncle Quentin placed in me." "That sounds perfect." The call waiting beep interrupted our conversation. "Christina, hold on. I've got another call." It was Bradley. "Jerry, I heard about the financial discovery. News travels fast. Jerry, I owe you the biggest apology of my life." "Bradley, no, please let me say this. When I first heard about your inheritance, all I could think about was money. When I realized how valuable the collection was, all I could think about was bigger money. I never stopped to consider what the inheritance meant to you personally, or what Uncle Quentin had really entrusted you with. Bradley, we've been through this. Jerry, you turned down opportunities to make hundreds of millions of dollars because you understood that preserving the collection was more important than maximizing profit. I called you selfish and stupid for making decisions based on legacy rather than money. But now, finding out about Uncle Quentin's hidden fortune, Jerry, he was testing you." "What do you mean?" "He was testing whether you would make decisions based on greed or based on character. He could have told you about the money from the beginning, could have made things easy by giving you obvious financial incentives to preserve the collection. But instead, he made you choose between immediate profit and long-term legacy. And you chose legacy even when you thought it might cost you everything." I'd never thought about Uncle Quentin's approach in those terms, but Bradley's analysis made sense. Uncle Quentin had structured his inheritance to reward character over calculation, to ensure that whoever received his legacy would be motivated by the right values. "Bradley, what are you trying to say?" "I'm trying to say that I was wrong about everything. Wrong about you, wrong about the inheritance, wrong about what was important, and I'm trying to say that I'm sorry. I appreciate that. Jerry, I know I don't deserve it after how I acted, but is there any chance you might need help managing the financial side of the estate? Not as a partner or anything like that, but as an employee? Someone to handle the business aspects so you can focus on the museum and preservation work? It was a humble request from a man who had demanded 15% of my inheritance just months earlier. Let me think about it, I said. Of course. And Jerry? Christina and I want you to know that we're incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. You took Uncle Quentin's trust and turned it into something that will benefit people for generations. That takes real vision and real character. After I hung up, I switched back to Christina's call. Dad, was that Bradley? Yes, he wants to apologize and maybe work on the estate project as an employee rather than a partner. What do you think? I think people deserve second chances, especially family. But I also think I need to be very clear about boundaries and expectations. That sounds wise. 3 weeks later, I offered Bradley a position as the estate's director of operations, with a generous salary but no ownership stake in the collection or the property. His job would be to handle the practical aspects of running what had become a complex operation, involving the museum partnership, the restoration work, ongoing conservation, and the various financial and legal matters related to managing Uncle Quentin's fortune. He accepted immediately and threw himself into the work with an enthusiasm and professionalism that impressed everyone involved with the project. Jerry, Dr. Richardson told me after Bradley had been working for a month, "Your son-in-law has been invaluable. His business experience and local connections have solved a dozen problems that we didn't even know we had." The estate officially opened to the public 18 months after I'd first discovered the treasure room. The opening ceremony was attended by museum directors from around the world, government officials and art historians who described the collection as the most significant privately assembled cultural archive in American history. But the moment that meant the most to me came 3 days after the public opening, when Christina brought little Sarah to visit her grandfather's museum for the first time. Sarah was 9 months old, too young to understand the significance of what surrounded her, but old enough to be fascinated by the beautiful colors and shapes of Uncle Quentin's carefully preserved treasures. I carried her through the restored rooms, pointing out paintings and artifacts, telling her stories about her great-great-great-uncle who had spent his life collecting beautiful things so that future generations could learn from them. "Dad," Christina said as we stood in the mansion's grand foyer, "I wish Mom could see this." "I think she can," I said, bouncing little Sarah on my hip while she reached for the light reflecting off a nearby glass display case. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret not selling the collection? I mean, you could have had even more money and you wouldn't have had to deal with all the complexity of running a museum." I thought about her question while little Sarah grabbed my finger and tried to put it in her mouth. "Christina, every morning I wake up in the restored carriage house, and I look out my window at the mansion where Uncle Quentin's collection is being studied by scholars from around the world. I see families bringing their children to learn about history and art. I see students working with artifacts that are helping them write dissertations and advance human knowledge. And I think about Uncle Quentin's letter, about how he trusted me to preserve something important rather than just maximize profit. I think about your mother, who always believed that the most valuable things in life can't be measured in dollars. And I think about little Sarah, who's going to grow up in a world where her family's name is associated with education and cultural preservation, rather than just wealth. I looked down at my granddaughter, who was now trying to grab the golden light fixtures that sparkled above us. "Christina, I wouldn't trade any of that for all the money in the world." 6 months later, the Whitmore estate received its first major academic award, the National Trust for Historic Preservation's highest honor for excellence in cultural conservation. The ceremony was held in the mansion's restored ballroom, with little Sarah crawling around on Persian rugs that were probably worth more than most people's houses. Bradley, now fully established as the estate's director of operations, had proven to be exactly the kind of professional manager the project needed. His business acumen, combined with his newfound respect for the collection's cultural value, made him an ideal bridge between the museum world and the practical realities of running a major tourist attraction. "Jerry," he said as we watched Sarah play near a display case containing ancient Egyptian jewelry, "I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "This project, working on something that's bigger than just making money, it's changed how I think about success." "How so?" "I used to measure everything in terms of profit margins and return on investment, but seeing what you've built here, seeing how the collection affects people who visit, there are forms of value that can't be quantified financially." "Bradley, are you getting philosophical on me?" He laughed. "Maybe a little. But Jerry, I want you to know that working on this project has been the most meaningful professional experience of my life." As the first year of the museum's operation came to a close, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed since that phone call from Harrison Fitzgerald. I'd gone from being a retired construction worker living on a modest pension to being the steward of one of the most important cultural collections in American history. I'd gone from worrying about paying property taxes on my small house to managing an estate worth more than $500 million. But the most important changes were personal rather than financial. I'd discovered that I was capable of much more than I'd ever imagined, not just in terms of managing complex projects and making difficult decisions, but in terms of having the vision to see beyond immediate circumstances to long-term possibilities. I'd learned that legacy and character matter more than wealth or social status, and that the most meaningful achievements are often the ones that benefit others rather than ourselves. Most importantly, I'd honored the trust that Uncle Quentin had placed in me, preserving and sharing his life's work in a way that would educate and inspire people for generations to come. 2 years after inheriting the Whitmore estate, I was sitting in my restored carriage house on a Sunday morning, reading the newspaper and watching little Sarah play in the gardens that had been returned to their original Victorian splendor. At 18 months old, she was walking now, toddling around the carefully maintained paths, while Christina and Bradley followed nervously behind her. The estate had become a regular gathering place for our family, a neutral ground where we could all appreciate the magnitude of what had been accomplished. "Grandpa Jerry," Sarah called out, though at her age it sounded more like "Grandpa Jerry." She was pointing at the fountain in the center of the main garden, which had been restored to working order and was now surrounded by flowers that bloomed in carefully planned succession throughout the growing season. "Yes, sweetheart, that's a fountain." The morning was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Richardson, who had driven up from Boston to discuss the museum's second annual report. "Mr. Caldwell, I have some remarkable news." "Good news, I hope." "Extraordinary news. The Whitmore estate has been selected to host next year's International Conference on Historical Collecting and Cultural Preservation. We'll be welcoming scholars and museum directors from more than 30 countries." "That's wonderful. But that's not the remarkable part. Mr. Caldwell, the conference organizers want to present you with their Lifetime Achievement Award for contributions to cultural preservation." "Me? Dr. Richardson, I'm not a scholar or a museum professional. I'm a retired construction worker who happened to inherit an incredible collection. Mr. Caldwell, you're a man who had the vision to preserve and share something priceless rather than selling it for personal profit. You've created an institution that will educate and inspire people for centuries. That's exactly the kind of achievement this award was created to recognize." As Dr. Richardson left to return to Boston, I walked through the mansion's public areas, observing the steady stream of visitors who were studying Uncle Quentin's collection with wonder and respect. In the Renaissance Gallery, a group of art students from Yale were examining paintings that their professor was using to illustrate techniques that had been lost for centuries. In the manuscript room, a medieval scholar from Oxford was photographing pages from the illuminated manuscript that was helping her complete a book about religious art in the Middle Ages. In the Egyptian wing, a family from Hartford was reading the display placards to their 2 young children, explaining how archaeological discoveries help us understand ancient civilizations. This was what Uncle Quentin had envisioned when he'd written about preserving something important and sharing it with the world. This was what he'd trusted me to create. That evening, as Christina, Bradley, and little Sarah prepared to drive back to Cedar Falls, Christina pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Dad, I need to tell you something. What's that? Bradley and I have been talking about moving up here permanently. To Millbrook County. There's a beautiful house for sale about 10 minutes from the estate. Victorian era, much smaller than the mansion, but still historically significant. We could restore it as a family project, and Bradley could work full-time as the estate's operations director without having to commute. Christina, that sounds wonderful, but are you sure? You'd be leaving your jobs, your friends? Dad, this estate has become the center of our family's life. Little Sarah is going to grow up thinking it's normal to have one of the world's greatest art collections in her backyard. Why wouldn't we want to be part of that? And Bradley is really ready to leave commercial development? Dad, Bradley makes more money working for you than he ever made as an independent developer. But more than that, he's found something he's passionate about. He talks about the estate's educational programs and conservation work like other people talk about their hobbies. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat on the carriage house's restored porch, looking across the gardens toward the mansion that now glowed with warm light from every window. Security guards were making their regular rounds, protecting treasures that had been hidden in darkness for decades, but were now being appreciated by thousands of people every month. I thought about Sarah, who would never know a world where her grandfather wasn't financially secure and socially respected. I thought about Christina and Bradley, who had learned to value legacy over immediate profit. I thought about Uncle Quentin, who had spent decades alone in that mansion, preserving something beautiful for a nephew he barely knew but instinctively trusted. Most of all, I thought about the phone call that had started this whole incredible journey. If Harrison Fitzgerald hadn't called that Tuesday morning, I would have continued living my quiet retirement, completely unaware that I was the heir to one of the greatest private collections in American history. But he had called, and Uncle Quentin had trusted me, and I had chosen to honor that trust rather than simply cash it in for personal profit. Now, instead of being a retired construction worker worried about making ends meet, I was the steward of a cultural institution that would outlast my life by centuries. Instead of leaving Christina a modest inheritance, I was providing her family with generational wealth and a legacy they could be proud of. Instead of spending my final years in quiet obscurity, I was spending them surrounded by beautiful things, meaningful work, and the knowledge that I had helped preserve something truly important for future generations. As I sat there in the warm evening air, listening to the fountain's gentle splash and watching the lights twinkle in the mansion's windows, I realized that Uncle Quentin had given me something even more valuable than money, or art, or historical significance. He had given me the opportunity to discover what I was really capable of when someone believed in me enough to entrust me with something truly important. And that, more than any amount of money, was the greatest inheritance of all. The last entry in my journal from that remarkable period reads simply, "Today I understood why Uncle Quentin chose me. It wasn't about construction skills or practical knowledge. It was about having the courage to see past immediate circumstances to long-term possibilities. It was about understanding that the most valuable things in life are the ones we preserve and share, rather than the ones we consume and hoard." 3 years later, the Whitmore estate welcomed its 100,000th visitor. Little Sarah, now 4 years old, served as the honorary ribbon cutter for the ceremony, wearing a dress that had been specially made to match the colors in one of Uncle Quentin's Renaissance paintings. Bradley, now permanently established as the estate's director of operations, had overseen the development of educational programs that were being copied by museums around the world. Christina had completed a master's degree in museum studies and was working as the estate's director of educational outreach. And I was living in my restored carriage house, waking up every morning to see the mansion that had been returned to its original glory, filled with treasures that were being studied and appreciated by scholars and visitors from around the world. The financial security was wonderful. Having access to more money than I could spend in several lifetimes had eliminated every practical worry from my life. But the real reward was knowing that I had honored Uncle Quentin's trust and created something that would benefit people for generations to come. Sometimes, late at night, when the estate was quiet and I was sitting on my porch looking at the mansion's illuminated windows, I could almost imagine Uncle Quentin sitting beside me, finally at peace, knowing that his life's work was being preserved and shared exactly as he had hoped. "Thank you," I would whisper into the darkness, though I was never sure whether I was thanking Uncle Quentin for the inheritance or thanking whatever force in the universe had given me the wisdom to handle it properly. Either way, I knew that I had been given the opportunity of several lifetimes, and somehow, despite all the pressure and criticism and doubt, I had managed not to screw it up. The Whitmore estate stands today as one of the premier cultural institutions in New England, welcoming scholars and visitors from around the world who come to study and appreciate Uncle Quentin's incredible collection. The mansion has been restored to a grandeur that exceeds even its original splendor, while maintaining every historical detail that made it special. Little Sarah, now old enough to understand that her family is somehow connected to all the beautiful things in the big house, has announced that when she grows up, she wants to be a treasure keeper like Grandpa Jerry. And sometimes when I'm walking through the mansion's restored rooms, watching visitors discover artifacts and artwork that have been preserved for their education and enjoyment, I think about that Tuesday morning phone call that changed everything. I think about how easy it would have been to listen to Bradley's practical arguments about development potential and immediate profit. I think about how close I came to making decisions based on fear and financial insecurity, rather than trust and long-term vision. Most of all, I think about Uncle Quentin's final gift. Not the money or the art or even the mansion, but the opportunity to discover that sometimes when we have the courage to preserve and share rather than consume and hoard, we create something far more valuable than anything we could have bought with mere money. The Quentin Whitmore collection will outlast all of us. Generations of scholars will study it, learn from it, and use it to advance human knowledge and understanding. Thousands of families will visit the estate and be inspired by the beauty and historical significance of what they see. And little Sarah will grow up knowing that her grandfather was the man who had the wisdom and courage to preserve it all, not because he had to, but because he understood that some things are too important to be measured only in dollars and cents. That, in the end, was Uncle Quentin's real treasure. The knowledge that there are still people in this world who understand the difference between price and value, between wealth and legacy, between having money and having meaning. And on quiet Sunday mornings when I'm sitting on my porch watching my granddaughter play in gardens that were designed by masters and preserved by dreamers, I know that I have received the greatest inheritance possible, the chance to be part of something that will matter long after I'm gone. The mansion's lights still twinkle every evening, just as they did during the Whitmore family's golden age more than a century ago. But now they shine not just for one wealthy family, but for everyone who values beauty, history, and the enduring power of human creativity. And that, I think, is exactly what Uncle Quentin had in mind when he wrote that simple line in his final letter. "The house will tell you its secrets if you listen carefully." I listened, I learned, and I preserved something beautiful for the world. In the end, that was worth more than any amount of money could ever be. Thank you for reading this story of family redemption and the true meaning of inheritance. If this tale moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, the most valuable things in life aren't inherited. They're earned through character, effort, and service to others. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. We love connecting with viewers from all across America who understand that real wealth comes from building something meaningful rather than just accumulating money.